Great. I think we will start now. Welcome everybody to the third in this Monash University webinar series, A Nature Positive Australia, Why Does It Matter and How Do We Get There? My name is Anita Förster. I'm an Associate Professor in Climate Change and Environmental Law in the Monash Business School, where I also lead our Green Lab, which is our hub for interdisciplinary research and engagement on climate change and sustainability. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Monash University in Australia operates on the traditional lands of the people of the East Kulin Nations, the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people. And I'd like to pay my respects to Bunurong and Wurundjeri elders past and present. And just to, And just to briefly set the scene for today's webinar, I'd like to start by reflecting on this term nature positive, what it means and where it comes from. So the nature positive goal has been developed and advocated by civil society groups in the lead up to the 2022 International Biodiversity Conference. The aim was to have a science-based goal, a science-based approach to draw attention to and to drive more effective responses to the global biodiversity crisis in a similar fashion to the net zero goal in the international climate change regime, which has had such an impact in shaping policy responses and private sector approaches to climate change. Now, there are some differing formulations and certainly differing interpretations of the nature positive goal. However, the definition I have up on the slide, put forward by the Nature Positive Initiative in 2021, certainly has broad support. And so this defines nature positive as a global societal goal to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030 on a 2020 baseline and to achieve full recovery by 2050. Now, to deliver this goal, it requires measurable net positive biodiversity outcomes through improvements in the abundance, diversity, integrity, resilience of species and ecosystems, and natural processes. And right at the end, there's a reference to the fact that achieving this goal will, of course, improve nature's ability to contribute to human well-being. Now, we've convened this webinar series at this particular point in time because it's a really important time to be discussing the nature positive goal and what it means for Australia. In the first webinar of this series, when we heard from some leading scientists at Monash University and Climate Works Australia, we were reminded that globally, but also in Australia, we're witnessing really alarming rates of biodiversity loss and environmental degradation, with massive implications for the wide range of ecosystem services on which our society and our economy depends. And then, as we discussed in the second webinar on Monday, there are certainly immediate opportunities to improve law and policy to support nature positive outcomes in Australia. So 2 years ago, in 2022, the Australian government signed up to ambitious biodiversity conservation targets in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. The term nature positive isn't used word for word in the Global Biodiversity Framework, but it's certainly broadly reflected in its targets and its scoping. Following this, the Australian government released their Nature Positive Plan in 2022 also, which sets out reforms to Australia's primary environmental law, the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, and introduces a new nature repair market. But progress on implementing some of these reforms, particularly the most important of them, has been slow and faces major barriers. More recently this year, in June 2024, the Australian government released the Australian Sustainable Finance Roadmap, a set of reforms designed to manage the financial risks posed to business and the financial system by climate change and other sustainability issues, and to help align private capital to meeting global sustainability goals. And while the government is addressing climate change initially through this Sustainable Finance Roadmap, it's certainly expected and indeed critical that the government moves swiftly to include other sustainability issues such as biodiversity and nature loss within that set of reforms. And then, of course, next week, the government will be hosting the first global Nature Positive Summit in Sydney. So for this webinar series, we really wanted to convey that we need insights from different disciplines and lots of different areas of practice to explore what the nature positive goal means for Australia. And we also wanted to share some insights from our current and ongoing research at Monash that's relevant to the nature positive goal. So in the first webinar, we started by explaining and exploring some of the scientific underpinnings for the goal and profiling some new science-based tools for measuring and supporting nature positive outcomes in practice. On Monday, we explored some of the current policy opportunities to strengthen law and policy for a nature positive Australia in the space of the EPBC Act, the nature repair market and sustainable finance reforms. And then today we are turning our focus to the social and behavioural sciences to focus on some of the key actors and behaviours that we need to shift if we're going to move towards the nature positive goal, and to help think about some of the key levers and drivers for behavioural change. And we're focusing that discussion particularly on the land and finance sectors because they're both very critical to achieving the nature positive goal in Australia. We know we need large-scale, comprehensive shifts in land use practices to manage land, not only for agricultural production, but also for ecosystem services such as nature repair and carbon sequestration. And we know that we need private investment to help make this shift happen. But what are the best ways to drive these changes? So I'd like to introduce the three speakers for today. Firstly, we have Professor Liam Smith, who's the Director of BehaviourWorks Australia, the behaviour change research enterprise within Monash Sustainable Development Institute. And Liam will begin by framing the question of nature positive as a question of behavioural change. Then Dr. Stefan Kaufmann, a senior research fellow also from BehaviourWorks, will focus in on the land sector and look at how landholders have responded so far to environmental market incentives for nature repair and how we might better support wider uptake of nature positive land management practices. And then finally, Dr. Na Pham from the Monash Centre for Financial Studies will explore what influences investor behaviour on ESG matters like nature, which is a really important part of the equation given the role that investors can play in helping to align private capital to the nature positive goal. So I'll welcome Liam to share his slides. I'll remind everyone that we'll leave Q&A till the end, and please put your questions in the Q&A as we progress through the speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Anita. I'm hoping you can hear me. Excellent, and see my slides. I'm seeing nods. Terrific. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Anita. And I'd also like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the lands of the people of the Geese Kulin Nation, the Bunurong people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. My job today really is to give you a bit of an introduction to a behavioural perspective on nature positive. And to talk to you through a little bit of a methodology or an approach that a behavioural scientist would or does take in the work they do. I'll then hand over to Stefan, who's also from our team in BehaviourWorks, who will talk a bit more about some particular applications of that approach and be able to within the land sector. But I'd like to start actually with a personal story. So I trained as an ecologist many years ago and was doing research probably about 25 years ago on a particular species of frog. Some of you might know this species. It's the growling grass frog. It's found in and around Melbourne. It used to be very common, but has certainly declined in numbers pretty significantly due to mostly habitat loss and chytrid fungus and it's certainly suffering. And I was doing some research. We were going out and tagging these frogs and measuring and seeing where they were going and what they were doing. And a development proposal came through to fill in a pond that this frog was using to breed. And I thought, perhaps naively, that the science would prevail, that the science that showed that this was an endangered species and it used this area as a key breeding habitat would prevent the filling in of the pond and the development from going ahead. I was wrong. I was really wrong, and in fact, what happened was the pond was filled in, and we kind of lost the battle, if you like. It was a really key moment, I think, in my career, and I think probably there's several on this call that probably have similar sorts of experiences that they might be able to sort of that resonate, which really was that the science is important and it's vital we have that, but actually the people were the ones that were the key actors in conservation. And that really drove me on a long career, essentially, including higher degrees and the like, to try and work out how do we motivate people to care for my frog. And so really that's sort of a premise that of this presentation, is that behavioural science and the social sciences can really help us achieve the goals of Nature Positive. So there's a few things I'm going to cover as I present today. Well, there's really only two. One is a bit of the behavioural view of Nature Positive. So what does that mean to behavioural scientists? And the second one is a bit of a process around how to develop effective behaviour change interventions. And as I said, I'll hand over to Stefan at the end of this, who can talk a little bit more about some of the a case study or a couple of case studies that he weaves in together. So I think this is a point I've already made, and I'll just reiterate it, that most problems, biodiversity problems, are ultimately human behavioural problems. In some cases, and we've got examples of climate change and invasive species and land clearing and litter and pollution, etc. Someone has done something to cause this to happen. In some cases, it might be in only fairly few actors doing something that's really deleterious, like the introduction of rabbits or the introduction of some in other invasive species, but other times it's lots of people doing things that cause problems like litter pollution and carbon emissions. And then sometimes it might be somewhere in between, where groups of people, particular target audiences, are doing actions that cause biodiversity loss, such as land clearing. I think the behaviourists would view biodiversity loss as a really wicked problem. And I think that's for quite a few reasons. It's very diffuse. There are many actors and many behaviours, and I'll get to that in a moment. But also as a result of that, there are many behavioural influences. So there's lots of reasons why people are doing these things that are causing harm and or not doing things that perhaps can lead us towards nature positive. A lot of these the biodiversity issues are very context specific, and sometimes the behaviour is a long distance away from the impact. So someone who might discard a piece of rubbish, might end up in the stomach or as a microplastic many, even years or months or years later inside a marine species. And likewise with carbon and carbon emissions. So there's lots of challenges around biodiversity from a behavioural science perspective. And this is a way that helps, I guess, understand how we see problems, how behaviourists see problems, this graph. On the y-axis, we have the number of audiences, and on the x-axis we have the number of behaviours. And wicked problems involve a lot of people doing a lot of things. And therefore, to take a behavioural approach, a lot of people need to do a lot of things differently to solve it. The problem kind of is for behavioural science is we work best when we are working with particular audiences and particular behaviours. That's where behavioural science, a lot of behavioural theory is most relevant and it's most applicable. And we've done a lot of the work in operationalising theory in order to put it into practice and solve things. So a lot of the time, and I'm going to talk to this in a minute about when we talk about a process for how you might go and design effective behaviour change interventions, we're trying to break down problems into really simple, wicked problems into simple problems or simple solutions, as in trying to answer the question of how do we get the most bang for buck with someone doing something differently? Who needs to do what differently to get the biggest effect? So that's kind of a bit of a preamble. I guess what I was trying to say is we see the world, behavioural scientists see the world as lots of people doing things, and those things make up problems, but they also make up solutions. And so, lots of people do lots of things differently. We might see a way forward to nature positive. But how might you go about doing that? The second sort of topic I'm keen to talk about today is how to design an effective behaviour change intervention, or a process for it. And I'll start with this slide, which I won't go through, but this is the methodology that our research group has developed 7 or 8 years ago now. We've used this extensively on several hundreds of projects across different spectrums of issues, including many biodiversity issues. But I will point out, and there are other similar methods and models. So I'm not saying this is the be all and end all, but this is one that we've developed and it works for us. There are sort of three main parts to it that are worth some explanation. The first is what we call an exploration phase, which is really understanding problems. And towards the end of that, we try and focus in on that question of who needs to do what differently to try and solve them. There's a second phase around deep diving, so really trying to understand why people are doing the things they do and what might work to change behaviour. And an application phase, which is really about trying to put things into field and test and see what works. We're going to go into a bit of detail around the first two of these, and you'll certainly see this figure again in Stefan's presentation, at least I think you will, in a moment. So some of the things that we like to do in an exploration phase is the map a system. So really understand particularly the actors and who they are and their relationships between each other. Obviously review evidence and literature, very standard in academic work, and stakeholder dialogues is where we talk to key stakeholders. But the final step, which is the one I'm going to focus on a little bit, but actually relates a little bit to system mapping, is behaviour identification and prioritisation. In other words, it's trying to solve that question of, given it's a wicked problem and it's got lots of behaviours and lots of audiences, how do we break it down into what's the most important thing that we try and influence? System mapping helps insofar as it helps us identify audiences and organisations, so the who in kind of the question of who needs to do what differently. But the behaviour identification and prioritisation piece is really about the behaviour, the what differently part. This is a tool that was developed by a student at BehaviourWorks 7 or 8 years ago. It's called the Impact Likelihood Matrix. Essentially suggests that when there's lots of behaviours question and we've only have limited resources to target some of them, we might want to go to those that have a big impact. You can see the y-axis there. There's a big impact, low or high impact. But also we want to consider how likely is it that someone's going to do that behaviour if they were asked to. And of course, likelihood can change with intervention, but we won't get to that at the moment. And we've used this tool on quite a few occasions. So, things like food waste and water consumption, it can create these sort of graphs that talk about a whole bunch of different behaviours and prioritise them based on the impact that they make and the likelihood people will perform them. And so it's a useful tool. And it's one that's also been applied around biodiversity. So colleagues of ours at the University of Queensland, although we were part of the work as well, and it's just been released literally about a week ago, a paper led by Angela Dean has really tried to prioritise based on, this is just the y-axis, this is the impact axis, where she surveyed, or the study surveyed 143 different biodiversity experts to try and gauge exactly what sorts of behaviours they thought would be most effective for communities to undertake to try and address biodiversity challenges. And what came up pretty much overwhelmingly as number one was to vote for strong conservation policies. And that was regardless of how long they'd been, an expert in biodiversity, the confidence with which they had around their estimations of impact, the organisation they came from, whether from uni or state government or other, and the discipline that they came from. So clearly we find that the voting, but there's also some around bush restoration, consumption behaviours, and reducing carbon footprint that certainly can help. So this comes from the experts and helps us understand impact. Just on that, we've also done a similar study led by Matt Zielinski, who was at RMIT at the time, who did that specifically for Victorian audiences. He mapped both impact and he didn't call it likelihood, but measured plasticity, so the likelihood that people can move behaviour. And again, he found some overlaps with this sort of model in that some of the behaviours were purchasing behaviours, certainly voting behaviours, and the other one that came out quite high was meat consumption, red meat consumption. So that's kind of explorations. That's how we break it down and say, these are the really key things that we need to focus on if we're going to make a difference. There's also this second phase, which essentially when you've got the behaviour, you're really interested in, well, how do I actually change it? And that's what we call the deep dive. And it has these fairly standard tools like working out what behavioural science theories or frameworks might be most helpful. What are the drivers and barriers? We might want to review from the literature what works to change behaviour, but ultimately we want to gather, particularly with our partners, and work out what we might want to try and intervene or change behaviour. So that's his intervention design. So these are kind of steps in the deep dive. I'm just going to touch briefly on this diagnose behaviours one, because I think it's actually a pretty important step. This is a model of behavioural drivers. I'm not going to go through it because it's got lots of parts to it. We like this one because it's actually an analysis of about 60 odd theories of behaviour that sort of looked at commonalities across those theories and sort of came up with these 8 sort of common factors that seem to influence behaviour. So we quite like it. Probably what is worth noting is that the ones on the right are probably more conscious drivers of behaviour and the ones on the left are slightly less conscious, but it's not a golden rule. So these are drivers that we're interested in. But importantly, and we have techniques and approaches for trying to understand which of those are might be driving behaviour. And importantly, getting that understanding involves talking to target audiences. I think we see a lot of intervention design that happens without actually speaking to target audience. So I'm proud to say, our staff go out and sit with farmers and they sit with decision makers and try and understand why they undertake the behaviours they undertake. Importantly, once you understand which drivers, there are particular kind of intervention functions, we call them. So these types of tools that might work to change that behaviour. You can see the list there on the right, in which how they sort of map to the different driver of behaviour. And then and there's a bit of a description about the intervention functions, and you can scroll through those, but pretty much they are what they say they are. And some of these clearly align to legal and policy options to trying to change behaviour. So clearly coercion and restriction, typical more legal policies around incentivization and enablement. And then likewise, incentivization is a useful tool to drive and affect attitudes and habits. And the reason I highlight this one at the end is because Stefan's going to talk a little bit about this in his presentation next. So I think some of the key take-homes that I'd like people to take out of this is human behaviour is both the cause of and solution to the biodiversity crisis. It certainly makes our view of the world is that everything is made up of people doing things. That creates problems, but it also creates solutions. Behavioural science works best when it targets specific audiences and behaviours, and so we need processes to try and break it down and focus in on those particular things. And it also offers a range of tools and processes that can help, via tools or approaches like our methodology. There are others that OECD and World Health Organization and Behavioural Insights team and the like have. But by using those, we can really put behavioural science to work to help foster a nature positive transition. Thank you. I'll hand back to you, Anita.
Great. Thank you, Liam. That's great context for Stefan, who we'll invite now to share his slides and take some of that theory into thinking about behaviours in the land sector.
Thank you. Just managed to lose my slides temporarily. Bear with me. Here we go. All right. So yeah, thanks. As was introduced by Anita and Liam, I work in behaviour change, but I've got a particular interest in how we can use it to understand and accelerate transitions and the kinds of wicked problems Liam was talking about. And I'll jump right in and tell you about an example of a string of projects where we've applied that kind of lens. So as if you've attended the previous seminars, you've heard that there's good reasons to be concerned about the reality of a nature positive future right now, and in particular, looking across the social, economic, and environmental goals of things like the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a lot of reason to be worried, and in particular, when we look at the impacts of Australia's land use on the natural capital boundaries that we work within for a safe climate and a nature positive future, things aren't looking too good. We're at or beyond several boundaries, and this is based on some work from our sister organisation Climate Works at MSDI. And one of the consequences of this is that farmers and land managers have never had so much off-farm attention on how they work on their farms, and this context includes the nature protection commitment of 30%. It's worth noting that a significant portion of land is already protected, but it's arguably not ambitious enough. And particularly the policy response is relying heavily on NGOs and Indigenous groups to protect lands, and yet there's not enough funding allocated to support these groups. some estimates have been done that something like 1.7 billion per year might be required, and that's considerably less than what has been allocated. When we look at things in the financial and business sector, the various task forces for carbon and biodiversity disclosure are really directing a fire hose of environmental, social and governance, institutional investor and philanthropic money into land management changes, and particularly natural capital markets, many of which are regulated and already exist in Australia, but others are also global and exist through third party and civil society organisations too. And crucially, these all rely on land managers being able to deliver verifiable improvements on natural capital aspects of their land as a result of changing their practices or their operations. And so we do have a situation here where we're relying a lot on markets and incentives being trusted to shift private land uses. And this is in the context of what several reviews, and again, if you attended the previous legal and policy session, you heard a lot about some of the limitations and challenges we have in how we oversee existing markets and the current reforms and new frameworks coming forward. And the net outcome here is it's a good situation for greenwashing and extracting value and rent seeking, but not so good for everyone else, and particularly these broader goals that we have. And so despite some of the mainstream, it's really great that there is an Australian farm sustainability framework, but some of its underlying messages seem to be that we're actually doing pretty great. We don't need to change too much. I don't think what you would have heard across this seminar series supports that conclusion. Australian agriculture is rapidly depleting natural capital, and that's what makes the prospect of flipping to more nature positive approaches so attractive. And so really this talk starts with recognising that there's limited consideration being given to private landholders' own motivations and pressures as drivers of change, the potential for grassroots innovations that might be occurring within and around the existing frameworks and the emerging frameworks, and particularly the hybrid role farmers can play in shaping nature repair markets. And what I'm basing this on is we've had the opportunity to work on 4 or 5 projects in this space, particularly looking at farmers' engagement in environmental markets or natural capital markets. And in particular, what I'll be focusing on today is some of the work we did in New South Wales with local land services and other partners around a environmental markets leadership program, building farmers' capability and leadership in markets. And also some in-depth evaluation and comparisons between a innovative landscape scale effort to link up different properties, efforts on carbon and biodiversity in Traprock in Queensland. And we compared that with one of our partners' work in Goulburn Broken CMA or Catchment Management Authority in Southern Victoria. And these form quite a nice cross-section across Southeast Australia, and particularly the grey box grassy woodlands, which is a common biodiversity value across these different sites we were looking at. You heard from Liam about the behaviour change method, so I won't dwell on that, but essentially we drew on aspects of this throughout each of these projects. Let's focus in on what does this idea of a nature repair market mean for a farmer? I mean, in a fairly essential form, what we're talking about is a value exchange based on demonstrating improvements in environmental services that are attributable to changes in land management practices and or farm operations. And often people are thinking of biodiversity or carbon offsets in this case, but there are markets for other things like air quality, water, and others. And as I'll expand in a moment, there are other types of value extraction that can come from it. So once a farmer has actually changed their land management practices and can show that there's an improvement, it can extend well beyond offsetting. So yes, there's the opportunity to generate credits, but a farm operation might want to inset those credits to show that they're carbon neutral or nature positive, for example. They might not like the value or price of opportunities to exchange credits, and so they might be wanting to sit on them and offer them in future. And of course, then there's the selling them. But there's also things like accessing green finance. They might be able to get attractive insurance or loans. Various land management authorities from the local government up can offer incentives, tax or rate relief based on improved land management practices. There's quite a lot of evidence that different farm commodities can realise productivity and quality benefits from increasing natural capital values of their land. And of course, in a world where we have existing carbon borders and we'll have increasing attention to biodiversity and possibly circularity and waste in future, being able to access and secure markets, particularly export markets, might depend on being able to verify the environmental performance of products produced on farms. And so already as we begin to decompose the wicked problem Liam was talking about into different behaviours and options, there's a wide variety of things farmers could be doing, and obviously each of these has a whole bunch of precursor behaviours required to do them. And a really key thing I want to focus in here is that the whole idea is demonstrating improvements in environmental services. And that actually means that you need to know what the natural capital asset value of your land is, and also what the impact of changes you've made have done. And so if we think about the kind of journey a farmer or land manager might need to go through, they might consider taking an initial site and opportunity assessment, consider what their own carbon and biodiversity footprint is that they might need to offset or take into account in their accounts for their land. They need to consider, what does this mean for their farm business planning? Is it actually worth going further down this path or not? And pretty quickly, they get to the point of having to establish a rigorous baseline that will be credible in the various schemes or opportunities they're considering and targeting. And of course, there's a plethora of frameworks and approaches, some of them managed by governments, others in civil society and by third-party organisations. And so even that is quite a complex choice. And there's costs associated with doing that kind of rigorous baseline assessment. And then that might need to be certified, certainly need to be registered into a credible platform or source that can monitor and report into. And then finally, there's the opportunity to market to investors in supply chain, funders, or finance, and also marketing to consumers. So again, a whole string of behaviours there that land managers need to engage with. And of course, because this is a dynamic moving space with new regulations and laws, with new market opportunities, they're not passive actors either. So land managers are actually shaping the future as they go forward, and they're doing things like participating in trials and pilots, experimenting with new types of transactions, participating in landscape scale transactions, like one of the examples we'll talk about, providing feedback to policymakers, lobbying directly and through their bodies, and maybe being directly consulted as well. So lots of things for farmers to do in this space. And we can think of the challenge here as, yes, partly about adoption. So it's very common in talking about land management practice diffusion to talk about Roger's diffusion of innovation curve, and some of the extension and policy people we interviewed as one part of these projects very much framed it as that regardless of the new thing you're trying to push out there, farmers can be slow to take up new innovations, they're time poor, there's always numerous competing opportunities, and having trusted, informed advisors who can help adopt or implement off-the-shelf solutions does help. So we could think of this as purely being about how do we help overcome that chasm between early adoption and mainstreaming. But what our research has really shown, I think, is that general core problem is made a lot more challenging by some of what's happening around environmental markets in Australia. First of all, it's probably worth noting that the people we researched in the different programs, they're not normal, as Liam often would like to say. I was hoping you'd drop that line, Liam, but yeah, they're highly motivated. They have high conservation aspirations, they have high entrepreneurial aspirations, they're willing to take smart risks, and they still want to have a productive and active farm. And that's likely to be different from that stereotypical mainstream farmer we were talking about. And so they're almost a best case, if you like, for some of what we're talking about. But when we actually map some of the barriers and facilitators to get involved in markets that they experience, a very interesting picture emerges that shows that it is not just about the slow diffusion of innovation, even for those early adopters. And in particular, when we look at barriers that are relevant to all the groups we spoke to, the difficulty of understanding and the complexity of the different options was definitely there. Concerns about opportunity costs and lock-in was up there, and across all of the participants, it was top 5 was the additionality problem, which is essentially that, can you show that you've actually improved land management outcomes on your land, the natural capital values, or are you double counting or at risk of being incentivized to do something you've already done? So that's very present. But when you look at farmers who are already involved in some form of transaction versus those who are just contemplating it in our research, the contemplators or the potential participants, one of their key concern is that the baseline measurement, that initial assessment I was talking about, is too hard. And they also don't trust the market brokers and aggregators who are trying to persuade them to agree to do some form of transaction as well, particularly when we're talking about carbon and biodiversity credits. There's also concerns about the costs involved, the risks and unknowns, and also some fears about the possible impact on productivity and quality of the business. In contrast, the farmers we spoke to who were already involved in markets, they had a bit of buyer's regret on some aspects. So some of them were upset about that they might be offsetting poor behaviour by Santos or BHP or the like, for example. Others were concerned about that now they were deep into it, the technical methods are still quite difficult to understand, and the guidance and so on is changing. And there was also some concerns and fears that were much more important to them than the rest of our sample around what happens to their data, who has access to it and control of it. So you could call that data sovereignty, that they might actually be assessed by banks or their supply chains using this information without their knowledge, and they're concerned about that. And so when we look at what helps farmers get engaged in markets and enter these transactions, sorry, there was also some other features too that, yeah, even things like prioritizing intent elsewhere, that was somewhat important overall, but not as important as a distinguisher between the two groups. So going back to that quote about the diffusion of innovation. But again, on the barrier side of things, sorry, the facilitator side of things, all of our participants found identifying as a steward, someone who wanted to improve land management, natural capital values while being a productive farm was important. Leaving their land in a better condition was important for all of them, but even more so for those contemplating getting involved. And also the supporting a transition to a diversified, sustainable business model was a really key driver as well. And both groups really enjoy learning new skills and knowledge. And so again, these are people who are up for a challenge, want to take on new things. For the already involved, there was this benefit of the incentive. So the upfront short-term benefits was significant, and that was more significant for them than for the overall group as well, in terms of its frequency of mentions. They were also influenced by seeing other farms like them do it. In fact, that was the single most commonly mentioned facilitator, and the expectations of people important to them. And often this is family members or their partners, but it could include friends, their kids, others as well. In terms of the expected facilitators for those considering getting involved, they do want credible and clear information on rights and obligations. They do want to meet other farmers doing it. They want an affordable and trusted monitoring, verification, reporting provider. And they want trusted advisors who don't have a vested interest in the outcome to give them good advice on it. And again, there were some other factors that were significant, but not as clear a distinguisher between those two groups. So in our second project that I'm going to talk about, this led us to ask ourselves, well, if we want more land managers to adopt these natural capital improving land management practices, and we think incentives are a way to do it, could it be that having independent community-based natural resource management groups, or maybe more involvement from the natural resource management bodies, could that help? And so in a project that was looking at pathways to increasing climate resilience and reducing vulnerability to climate change, we ended up with this interest, and working with a number of partners got to this question. And in particular, we wanted to look at when you have support for a community-based natural resource management group supported by the region and a farmer-owned cooperative, it turned out, in the model we settled with, which is the partner, does that overcome some of these barriers that we identified in that previous research? And the theory of change is essentially that with that extra support, they might get that trusted advisor, that affordable verification reporting, and so on. That might lead to a better outcome and better intermediation of all the barriers and facilitators that shape things. And in essence, this is this idea of helping with that initial light assessment and taking them through the process of getting to having a verifiable improvement to take to market. Now I'll prejudge the outcome by telling you it only sort of helped. So essentially in the case study we looked at, which at that time was engaging with 14 land managers, trying to get them to engage in a landscape scale collaboration across a region in southern Queensland. A lot of them really balked at the step of having to do that rigorous baseline assessment I was talking about. And on the scale of things, this was expected to cost somewhere between $5,000 and $15,000, depending on the property and the nature of it. But this was a big barrier for them to take on as an upfront cost, which is significant, as I'll explain in a minute. In the more qualitative work we did around it, there was certainly quite a lot of evidence that the initiative helped overcome some of those barriers we were talking about. It was very important for the people we were talking to manage a farm that supported the people dependent on it and would be sustainable. They did hold these stewardship values. My impression of them was that they were very competent risk managers who were weighing up heaps of really consequential decisions about their farms. And so they were under a pretty big cognitive load. They did fit that stereotype of asset rich, cash poor, and many of them were thinking about transitioning their business models or even retirement as a vehicle for being involved in this. And even for the very production orientated farmers in the group, diversification was a priority because they felt under a lot of pressure to diversify and wanting a more sustainable business model. This is also a region that's got a strong history of sustainability innovation, very strong social capital in the local industry group, the Traprock Group. There was a local champion who was a big promoter of the program involved in the Traprock Group, who was behind it. And many of our interviewees basically said, I'm in it because he's involved. They were less interested in the background stuff, but they were very influenced by that local supporter. And an attitude that was common, particularly amongst those who were less environmentally minded, was this is a pressure we're under to explore anyway. So this seems like a good group to work with to navigate these pressures. And this, the pressure I'm talking about here, there was supply chain pressure. Some of them were selling wool. Many of them were selling meat and horticulture products to supermarkets. And they're all asking them questions about what's the carbon footprint of your work, of your products. They in an area that used to be known for some of Australia's highest quality wool exports, but they've been through economic transition and change, and they've already had to diversify, and they're expecting to diversify again. They have genuine doubts that state and federal governments really care about what happens to them and are supporting them, so they're not very trustful of the broader governance institutions around them. They're well aware of the flawed carbon market and the immature nature of the biodiversity market, remembering here that we're talking at 2022-23 period. And they did value the support of the Farmer Mutual Cooperative, a supportive but hands-off land restoration fund in Queensland, and the supportive but notably under-resourced natural resource management region in South Queensland landscapes as well. So all these were tailwinds that were helping. And it's also important to note we're talking about an area that has pretty poor carbon characteristics but very good biodiversity values. But there was some evidence to support the idea that there was this win-win of improved tree cover and pasture, which at least maintained, if not improving productivity, and could lead to carbon biodiversity outcomes. And they're in a significant rainfall drainage area for the Murray-Darling Basin, which has implications for water availability. And they enjoy some current natural advantages for things like fruit setting, meaning they can bring horticulture products to market a little bit sooner than other parts of Australia and get premium prices for it. But that's going to change with climate change, and they're well aware of that as well. And so in short, we saw the barriers that we expected addressed, but others came to the fore. And at the time, we saw what you might call a barely viable landscape scale transaction and a lot of information going on. And it wasn't clear when we finished that phase of the project that things would go much further, although I have a upbeat update for you at the end of this that I'll share. And so the kinds of things we can take from this is that, yes, this kind of program can be successful in reducing most of the farm operational decision-making barriers, but the participants were still pretty ambivalent about the prospects of doing a positive market exchange in the process. The groups that were working with them definitely did play an important intermediation role, and they helped reduce some of the frictions between markets and governance and other layers by providing those local trusted advisors and explaining and translating these things, working with the farmers on their schedules and timing. But there's also some micro frictions that come with engaging with the program. They are busy, time-poor people. Some fruit harvesting was happening at the time, which prevented some people's ability to get involved, that kind of thing. And so I guess if I think about what's missing, what could a nature repair market in future help with? We're seeing early adopters who are savvy, holistic risk decision makers, but they're fundamentally unwilling to take on input costs with uncertain results, even with a good supportive program around it. And so a very straightforward thing I think that could be done is providing land managers with a payment to conduct that kind of baseline assessment of natural capital, and not tie that to having to produce then carbon credits or biodiversity credits or anything else, but actually giving them the ability to decide what's right for their business model, their aspirations and their goals. And that could be a highly impactful initiative. And I think about that in the bigger picture of how do we make nature positive, well, ultimately positive. It's clear that bureaucratic solutions to climate crisis, such as these offsets and credit schemes, have got a lot of problems. We need a better integration of the science, the policy, and the behaviour, which is the underlying logic of this whole seminar series. And then particularly unless and until uncertainty can be reduced and the assessment, measurement, and reporting for these transactions can be relatively easy and cheap, adoption is likely to remain low. And when we think about the asymmetrical market power and supply chains, the situation is pretty bad for farmers and landscapes. It doesn't look like without some very careful policy design, we're not going to reproduce those problems. It needs to be very carefully done. And this leaves me with some doubts about the likelihood of developing high quality, regionally appropriate nature repair markers in Australia unless we really do change up how we've designed these things and implement them. What that might look like, a renewed commitment to extension and intermediation will help. So, you know, helping these cooperative bodies, land care groups, natural resource management bodies, I think they're a really key, under-resourced, particularly in different parts of the country, actor who could be playing an important role. And I do think that opportunities may exist in regional sustainable development initiatives where maybe the people buying or investing in natural capital and nature repair markets might be in the same region and have closer real relationships with the farmers and land managers. They might have opportunities to produce higher quality, more holistically beneficial transactions as well. This might mean working in farmer and cooperatives with local champions. You know, ultimately the vision here is, can we flip the script on how we meet these day-to-day food and fibre needs in a climate safe, nature positive and circular future? Now, the upbeat bit I was going to talk about is I found out last month that the Trap Rock project did produce a tradable credit situation, and in particular, they've got an agreement to sell the first 1,000 Australian carbon credit units from the project to a Carbon for Good charity who's willing to pay $100 per unit, which is significantly above the current trading price. And that's a premium they've achieved. And importantly, that is because they were able to link the carbon improvement with this biodiversity corridor concept in their landscape scale initiative they were doing. They will receive an upfront payment of about 60%, and then they'll also receive a longer, importantly, cost-smoothed, if you like, payment over the rest of the 24 years. And I think this shows that, yeah, my initial version of this talk was a bit more pessimistic, saying that even with all the support that you'd asked for, this is really hard. This shows that it actually is possible. But I still think this is a bit of a unicorn example, and we need to find a policy setting, a set of enablers and capabilities around this kind of work that makes this kind of thing possible around the country, which doesn't rely on having such a perfect combination of support for it to happen. And so that's my mildly pessimistic upbeat conclusion for the talk. And I'll hand back to you, Anita.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stefan. That was fabulous. We're going to shift now really to the other side of the coin, and probably quite a distance from the context that Stefan is talking about, to consider the role of large institutional investors and how they're approaching nature-related issues. And I guess the ultimate aim is to bring those two worlds closer together. So I'll invite Na to present now on that topic.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you, Liam and Stefan, for the very interesting presentation. I would like to contribute to this discussion from the investor's perspective. Can you still hear me? Because all right, that's good, because I saw some notifications of unmuting myself. Okay. So apart from my role at Monash, in which I actually do a lot of ESG research and engagement with with the business community and investor community, I also chair a financial capital committee of the International Corporate Governance Network, which represent global investors with maybe about more than $70 trillion of asset under management. So what I want to contribute to our discussion today is from that angle, because looking at the disclosure information, what investors want to understand from the business community, what kind of nature-related information they want to see from the companies in their disclosures, and how investors utilize those information or the disclosures in their investment decision-making process. So what I will be talking about today, just a very brief recap of what the nature challenge is. This is just because we understand that even though this is a series of 3 webinars, we might have new audience, and it may be beneficial for the audience to understand. So what are the key challenges here again? And then I will introduce the task force for nature-related financial disclosures, the TNFD. The TNFD also may not be new to many of us, but it is still served as a very good background framework for our discussion today. So it's definitely worthwhile to revisit that. And we talk about nature-related issues from the business and investor community perspective. And then we examine the links between nature-related risk, opportunities, business performance, and the financial effects on an organization. And then I will share some example of how investors analyze risk and how do they take action. So just a very quick recap in terms of what we mean by the nature challenge. We understand that the world's stock of nature resources, which include land, air, rivers, oceans, and all living organisms and communities, such as plants, animals, and forest, are all referred to as natural capital assets. And these assets provide a range of ecosystem services and that enable the society to work. And when from the business community and the investor community, the key challenge is to define standards, identify data and metrics to measure nature-related dependencies and risk. And this is a critical step in understanding financial materiality and taking steps to address the challenge. And you will hear the concept of financial materiality again and again in this presentation, because we understand there is a lot of different ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues that investors are paying attention to. And the way for them to identify areas of prioritization is based on the understanding of what issues are financially material to investors. Okay. So let me move now to introduce, this is a very quick introduction of the TNFD. Now, after the success of TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and we see the upcoming of the TNFD. Now, the TCFD has been integrated into many legislations, and this is the same expectation for the TNFD. So hopefully it is started as a kind of a market-led, science-based and government-supported global initiative. So it's initiated by the business and investor community, but hopefully in the future it will be integrated into the global legislations around nature-related disclosures. So the mission of the TNFD is to develop and deliver a risk management and disclosure framework that would allow organizations to report and also to act on nature-related risk. Now, the goal is to shift money or financial flows away from nature negative outcomes and toward nature positive outcomes. And also, this is a disclosure framework. So the purpose is to promote consistency and standardized nature-related disclosure. Now, the structure, the recommended structure for disclosure, and this is for especially targeting listed companies, very big organizations in the market. So in their disclosures, they should disclose the governance of nature-related risk and opportunities, how the business have factored risk and opportunities into their strategy, in their business strategy, what kind of metrics and targets are set, and how do they manage risk. And in this specific context, it is nature-related risk. And in terms of the scope of risk, we are looking at physical risks, transition risk, and systemic risk. And when we look at the nature-related issues, we understand that in terms of reporting, companies have to report four pillars or four concepts. First is about dependency, how the organization depends on nature. Impacts, that means how the organization impacts nature. Are they causing negative impact? Are they contributing to any negative impact? What are the risks to the organization stemming from their dependencies and their impact? and what are the opportunities. And the opportunities here is about how can they actually restore nature, how can they create positive impact or mitigate the negative impacts of nature. Yeah. And from the business community, from the TNFD, there is a framework that help or that guides company in order to identify and assess nature-related issues. And there are 4 key components of this approach. And it is called LEAP for short. Basically, it covers locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. So the starting point of identification and assessment of nature-related issues for an organization is to be able to locate their major interfaces with nature. So basically, at what point are they interfacing with nature and interfacing with sensitive locations? And the next step is to be able to evaluate their dependencies and impacts. So they need to understand the environmental assets that they are using, the ecosystems and services that they depend on, and the impact drivers. And from there, they identify dependencies and impact, measure that, and also assess the materiality of the dependency and impacts. And from the evaluation, they would assess the risk and opportunities. And lastly is to prepare a strategy, to prepare an implementation plan for target setting, managing performance, reporting, and presenting the disclosure information. So this is a LEAP approach. Basically, is a tool for companies to look at how the nature-related risk and opportunities. But how does investors look at this? So the way that investors look at this is to be able to see from the analysis of companies, what are the systemic risk, physical risk, transition risk the companies can identify? How are they building resilience to deal with such risk? How do they manage risk, but also how do they realize the opportunities? How do they factor that into their strategic planning and risk management and the financial effects of that? And with the financial effects, they want to really look at a lot of different things, but definitely the importance of the impact on the cash flows of the company is quite important. So Stefan, for example, mentions with the farmers, when they are doing the right things, they can enjoy the positive impact on their capital, cost of capital. They have easier access to green financing. They have many other, they have premium when they generate the offsets, for example. So all of those financial effects have to be considered by the companies and also by the investors. And from that model, they will work out what are the business performance and sustainability performance of the organizations. So business performance, they will look at the traditional metrics, including market access to markets, capital, fund flows, financing, the range of products and services that companies have, the efficiency in terms of using resources, and also reputational capital in terms of what kind of sustainability images or reputation the company has. And in terms of sustainability performance, it is about the key metrics is around sustainable use of natural resources and how they deliver ecosystem protection, restorations, and regeneration. So let me move to the investment world, where we talk about biodiversity funds and the growth of those over the years. Now, I presented here 2 sets of statistics, and then you can also see, there's a conflicting numbers, or the numbers differ a lot. On the left-hand side, you're looking at this a piece of research by MSDI, and they look at biodiversity funds. Basically, they divide them into 2 different groups: biodiversity labeled funds and then related funds. But the numbers are quite different from compared to the ones on the right-hand side of the screen, even though they are only just 1 year apart. Now, and you can also so that highlights that there's a lot of there's a lot of money going into promoting companies or organizations that are supporting biodiversity or creating a positive impact in biodiversity. But there's also a lot of not really confusion, but a lack of standardization when it comes to how you can label a fund, and whether the fund serve what purpose and what kind of impacts the fund's targets, and from there, how do you actually match them into different category in terms of biodiversity focus? Yeah. So if you look at the right-hand side from Phoenix Capital Impact Report, which just came out a few months ago, you can see that the number of biodiversity-related funds that is linked to either, so it depends on the description of the fund. They can be linked to SDG number 2, which is about sustainable agriculture, food security, SDG 6, which is about clean water, SDG 14, which is about life below water, SDG 15, which is about life on land. So this is a very broad coverage of the funds, but we can see that there are more than 1,000 funds that has some aspect of biodiversity in the description of the investment strategy. So there's a growing attention and growing momentum, and definitely we have seen this momentum a lot more clearly after the global biodiversity framework was adopted in 2022 at the UN Biodiversity Conference. So let's look at what how the investor community is kind of navigating this landscape, and what they need to do to understand their exposure and how they take actions. So I take this example, and this is a framework developed by Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and it is adopted by Robeco, which is also a very large asset manager. And so basically they're looking at the type of risk, including physical risk, transition risk, and maybe there will be also liability risk. And then they look at how or in what situation the risk will manifest. So whether that is related to decline in air quality, local climate, habitat, hazard regulations, or is it because of regulatory changes, for example? What kind of impact it might have on companies, and what does that mean for the company financially, and what does that mean for the investor financially? Let me give an example. For example, when the European Union bans imported goods that contributed to, or it could be linked to, deforestation, that is, so with that, the key commodities that will be affected would include beef, soy, coffee, and when those so when these bans are introduced in the European Union, we can see that will become a material issues for some companies. And so this is a change in policies and regulations, and it will become material for some companies, especially those in those sector or producing commodities that I just mentioned. And financially, it will also be material for companies and investors investing in those companies. And from that framework of analysis, investor will look at the current portfolio and investment portfolio of the companies, and how they of the investors, and how they could be impacted. And each investors may have their own framework. Some might have 1 to 5 scale of how they could be impacted. This is an example of high and very high impact, and what kind of sector that they would be impacted. So it could be the different drivers. It could be land use, freshwater, climate change, pollutions, groundwater, surface water, for example, water flow maintenance, and flood. So there are a lot of different factors, and each investors may identify some certain material issues that they prioritize. And from there, for example, understanding what are the material issues, what they want to do is integrate these understanding into the sustainable investment governance, they want to engage with companies. With Robeco, for example, they would have they build their exclusion strategy around this. That means companies that they would avoid, not to hold in their investment portfolio. There will be also, the whole thing will be in progress, because there would always be improvement to the way that they analyze materiality, analyzing impact. You can also see this is the area where investors cooperate a lot with academics to understand, and not just academics, but also NGOs and other type of organizations to understand the science behind all of these targets and measurements. And the end goal for investors is to actually look at issuer level, measure the risk and the exposure at the issuer level, and from there build quantitative targets in their portfolio and launch. Now, this was taken from the document of the companies in 2022. We understand that the companies have launched, this company in particular has launched the biodiversity investment strategy. So do many other major asset managers. They have also launched the biodiversity investment strategy as well. But still, the analysis of materiality, how they analyze impact, how they measure the issues at the issuer level is always been, or has always been, a work in progress. So I will stop here and go transfer it back to you, Anita, for the Q&A. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Na. And a nice kind of reference to that link between the EU's regulatory developments surrounding deforestation and Australian farmers, I think, which we may well pick up later in the discussion. But I'd invite everyone to please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll work through those questions as they come in. Perhaps while Na's presentation is fresh in our minds, we might start off with a question for Na. I mean, I think investors clearly have a really critical role to play in helping to align private capital to the nature positive goal, both through where they invest, so their allocation of capital, and also their stewardship, their engagement with companies. But this key driver for investors is obviously financial materiality. I wanted to ask whether investors face challenges in quantifying nature-related risks at different scales, and whether it's harder than climate change, where there has been so much progress in kind of thinking about climate change as a quantifiable financial risk.
Yeah, I do agree with you, Anita, that this is a very challenging topic for investors, and not sure whether we can compare the complexity of biodiversity and climate change, but it's just because I think it's just because the climate change has or focus has always been there for many investors, whereas biodiversity seems to be a new focus maybe in the last 5-10 years. And that's why there's a lot of resources have been being developed to equip investors to understand more. And the challenges is also, there are challenges in the complexity of the issues, but also how it is interconnected. It interconnects with many other environmental and social issues, because biodiversity and climate change, but also how people's lives are going to be impacted, the human rights issue as well. So it's about, the challenge also comes from that interconnectedness between all of these ESG issues. And the challenge is also because of there's always a lack of data. The data around biodiversity is quite patchy. The effort of the TNFD, for example, is to ask companies to start disclosing information and disclose that in a more systematic framework or approach, so that we can start to build the data points. And disclosure is a beginning, and from disclosure, investors would have more information that would engage with companies to understand how to improve, for example. And then from there, they would have better actions that target diversity. But I do agree, this is a very challenging area.
Great. Thank you, Na. we'll certainly come back to you later, but there are a few questions that have come through following Stefan and Liam's presentation. The first one asks, so from Liz Pride, any thoughts from Stefan or Liam on what can be done to promote the ongoing landholder management and maintenance that these projects require to achieve nature outcomes?
So I go, Liam, and you can fill any gaps.
Well, I think I was going to hand to you, Steph. I mean, I think one of the central tenets of what I was proposing is that speaking, engaging, talking to target audiences and to stakeholders is absolutely vital in the development of any behaviour change intervention. Steph, you've done that, so you're probably in a better position to judge about what would promote ongoing care and management. But yeah, so I haven't spoken to the farmers like you have, so you're probably in a better position to judge.
Yeah, well, so I'd say, and there was another question I answered off by text about which types of farmers we spoke to. So acknowledging that the farmers we spoke to are these entrepreneurial early adopters who really see a synergy or a viable pathway for being both conservationists and productive farmers. I think the majority of them really saw it as, you know, it would continue to be an ongoing farm that had increased biodiversity and carbon values on it. And so from that point of view, I guess having those natural capital values as inherent to the business model and the ongoing operation of the farm is one pathway that could happen. Now, given the scale and the nature of change that we need to see across the country, I think there's many other segments we need to understand, and there are also versions of improving natural capital values that do involve essentially no longer being a productive farm, and so I think that's a different problem and one that I feel less confident to say about. But for part of it, at least, I think where there is a win-win that people want to explore between it being a productive farm and having increased biodiversity and carbon values and the like, that's a pretty good way to go. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just add something to that? So I think, I mean, one of the key messages you were suggesting, Steph, is to get like the assistance around getting an assessment done in the first place, and that's represent a very significant barrier. I agree with that strongly as a finding, but also it creates opportunity, right? Because we have this concept in behavioural science called spillover, which says that if you do one thing, you're more likely to do another. And particularly with, you know, the researchers and several doctoral students have looked at what are those factors that help one behaviour spill over into another similar behaviour. And, you know, what we find is things like how people see themselves and their own identity, and the self-efficacy that they might gain. So I'm someone who can do this sort of thing. So I therefore, and we know that when people feel those things or have those sort of perceptions of themselves, that then they're more likely to spill over to do another thing, which might be the maintenance or another step towards nature positive. So and so interventions to try and do that, I would say encourage, you know, identity-based interventions that say, hey, you must be someone that really cares about this and you're really passionate about it, and give them kudos and credibility around that. And I think that would help. At least that's what the evidence says, at least, you know, the research. We need to trial these things in field, of course, to see what does work in reality, but certainly that would be my leaning, is to try and get people, help them over the first hurdle, but then encourage them further down the track afterwards.
Great. There's a bit of a follow-up question, I think, probably for Stefan here, talking about a really practical barrier to farmers getting involved in ecological restoration, just a lack of sector capacity in terms of seed supply, technology, those kinds of resources and capacity. Was that something that came up in your research? And do you have any thoughts on the best way to address that barrier?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a theme that's come up. You know, one of the projects I didn't talk so much about was around what would environmental market engagement mean for the Goulburn Broken region. It was a sort of a side project, and the issue of seed availability definitely came up in that context. I mean, stepping back a little bit, I would say, you know, this is a transition we're talking about here, which is to say that many different people need to do many different things, and relying on current markets and market signals to get us there isn't enough on its own. And so I think it does require interventionist policy. There's some well-articulated policy mix frameworks from the European Union around transitions that we could be applying here, and where there are these structural and capacity gaps like seed availability, I think there's a strong case for public investment to support those things. And if that's not possible, then maybe there are ways financial actors and businesses can be incentivized to provide those things too. But I think yeah, taking an active structured transition process and intervening where needed to make that happen is really key to this, because you know, the current market dynamics is what got us to where we are now. So we need to redesign the thing. Yeah.
Stefan, I have a question. You mentioned NRM organisations a few times in your presentation, including in the context of kind of being trusted intermediaries in bringing landholders in to the and educating them and supporting them in engaging with environmental markets. I wondered if you would also reflect on the role that NRM organisations might play in ensuring we get, I think you also use this term, high quality, regionally appropriate nature restoration, in terms of providing the strategic context so that these nature repair projects are in the right place, they're able to deliver co-benefits for water supply, for Indigenous participation in the market, for carbon as well as biodiversity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really hopeful that they can play that role, and there's a NRM Regions Australia report that explores the potential of markets for NRM's role in future, which is worth a read on this topic. I think, you know, we need to acknowledge that what is an NRM region across Australia, I think there's 57 of them, 54, something like that, across the country, is very diverse now. So they used to be I understand, a essentially federally funded thing out of the National Heritage Trust, but over the years they've become supported at the state level to different levels. So, you know, as my field partner Andrew Ward in the Trap Rock example used to joke, he said, "Wow, the environment must be really well managed in Victoria, because you have 11 catchment management authorities, which is the local name for an NRM region. And in Queensland, our partner South Queensland Landscapes, which is seems to be a semi-autonomous, you know, revenue generating, self-funding body almost, or at least I think they get some support. They're responsible for an area the same size of Victoria. So I guess it gives a bit of a picture that there's different capacities and roles of NRM regions. So with that caveat, I think yeah, acknowledging that different parts of the country would have different capacities, I think NRM bodies are a really important level of governance for that. And, you know, it aligns with the theory as well. Like when you think about Ellen Ostrom's thoughts about how to solve the tragedy of the commons and get good natural resource management, it's really, I think, institutions at that scale that she's talking about, and there's quite a lot of research supporting that sort of right size of you know, community integrated, regionally specific governance of these issues.
Great, thanks. There's a question here for Liam, kind of picking up your comments on spillover effects and small wins for biodiversity. So, and pointing to, so a question from Peter Davies, pointing to concerns of many farmers with the management of national parks, for example, fire management, weed management, and the implications for neighbouring landholders. Any insights as to reconciling these positive and negative spillover effects?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but perhaps just some clarification. And Peter, feel free to add maybe some clarification if you're still online. You know, spillover really refers to the individual that has done something. They are then predisposed or more likely to do something else that's in line with a common goal. So if the goal is nature positive, then we do something small. It predisposes us as individuals to maybe want to do something more. I've certainly heard that sentiment around, and so a farm may become more and more nature positive on the basis of spillover, right? And we might be able to foster that. So I'm not really sure about the positive and negative from national parks, but I've certainly heard that sentiment around, you know, national parks being the neighbours from hell and similar sorts of narratives that have come out of landholders. And for me, you know, behavioural scientist, I always go back to the basics, which is, well, who needs to do what differently? And perhaps before we get to that, you know, what's the stakeholder engagement look like? You know, I mentioned in the exploration phase, we often do things called stakeholder dialogues, where we bring people into the room to discuss issues and come up with joint solutions and what they might look like. And hopefully so that's a bit further upstream in terms of behavioural approaches. And that's the sort of thing that I think would suit these situations a little bit better. I think a farmer that's done a bunch of things to try and improve nature positive has a pretty good, credentials in that kind of forum, because they've clearly demonstrated that, they can make things work, they can solve for biodiversity as well as run a commercial farm. So I think they would be very good contributors. Hopefully you can get national parks to that kind of forum as well. But I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but I think that maybe partly answers it.
Thanks, Liam, and please feel free to add some further detail, Peter, if you're still online. If we go back to Na, I'm interested in, you kind of mentioned towards the end of your last point that investors have a whole range of different ESG issues they're considering and balancing, and these are just increasing over time, and nature and biodiversity is one of the more recent kind of additions to the ESG bucket. How do investors, really integrate this whole range of different, sometimes competing issues in their decision making, and is there a risk of overwhelm and insufficient resources for investors to do a good job of that?
Thank you, Anita. I do think that this is a very important question, because investors have limited resources, right? So they do have to have a framework to prioritize a lot of different ESG issues that could become important to them. And that's why the methodology for investors to understand what are material is quite important. And when I look at the way that investors look at this, they would have to look at materiality both at the sectoral level as well as the issuer level. And just to give you an example, some investors would have a framework that look at the sectoral level by maybe sector materiality tool or heat map, and then from that sectoral level they will come down to company level, which they would have framework to identify prioritizations and assessment. And this require very in-depth due diligence of companies, with their locations, but not just their location, but also supply chain, for example, to understand whether that companies will be exposed to certain type of risk, not just within their operation, but also in their supply chains. And then from there, they identify important sectors, sectoral issues, important companies issues, and then they identify the investment approach and engagement strategy. And with the engagement strategy, they also focus on material issues. They look at improving disclosure around nature-related disclosure, and monitoring the commitment of companies to deliver any nature-related targets that the company has. So a more recent example that you can see that Coles and Woolworths and IGA in Australia were kind of criticised by some NGO, but also some investors for not showing good commitment in their sustainability report about deforestations. And then after the criticisms, Woolworths come out with a commitment that they would not sell or buy beef that is linked to deforestations. So this kind of engagement, either from the broader business community, broader investment community, will have certain impact on the companies, but it's all based on what issues are material for the companies and for the investors. Yeah.
Thanks, Na. Okay. Looks like we've got one more question come in, which may be our last for today. Okay, I'll just run through it, and I think this may be a question for Stefan. There's a big incentive in carbon-focused markets for credit return for low-cost actions. This often equates to low diversity tree or forest plantings. How do we achieve high diversity restoration where this is potentially lower carbon or credit value? Investors and farmers have shown they prefer the low risk, low diversity, high carbon outcomes. This is especially important for grassland and open woodland systems that are being replaced with carbon forest plantings. So how do we kind of manage these tensions between achieving a climate outcome and a biodiversity outcome? Do you have any comments, Stefan?
Yeah, it's an easy one to fix, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think I mean it does relate to the quality and integrity of the measurement and reporting of just what assets you're improving. So, you know, I think part of the reason the Traprock example has gotten as far as it has is because they could show an interrelation between carbon benefits, which were relatively modest, and biodiversity benefits, which were relatively large in that area. So there are definitely scenarios where it's necessary and desirable to try and stack up those benefits and be able to verify them. I think the problem of, I guess, incentivizing those, you know, carbon heavy, biodiversity poor examples is a market design problem as well. And so I think it's really important to be clear about what is it, you know, what are these public goods we want out of these nature repair markets, and design them in and try and ensure that we don't incentivize the behaviors we don't want to see. But I think it's more than just the incentives, right? Like I think if those land management decisions and investment decisions are being made in a appropriate regional governance framework, like we were talking about, then there should be some protections on whether or not it's appropriate to do, you know, for example, a blunt monoculture afforestation in a region, as opposed to restoring previous land cover in a way that's harmonious with the landscape plans. And you know, I think particularly with the better natural resource management regions, they tend to have quite sophisticated strategic plans for the region that talk about appropriate land uses and appropriate natural resource values. So where that layer of governance support does exist, and I'm thinking here particularly of Goulburn Broken, for example, who have a I think a 6-region breakdown within their catchment of what's appropriate land use in terms of their strategic vision, based on, you know, closeness to the city, or is it broadacre cropping out in the west, and so on. It needs to be really integrated into that kind of thing. So it's not just a transaction between the land manager and the investor. It's actually part of a regional planning process for, you know, what kind of development do we want where, in the same way you would if you're assessing a renewable energy plant or a fruit packing plant. It'll be part of that same conversation.
Great. All right. Thanks, Stefan. We'll probably wrap up there because we're at time. I think, you know, just the discussion in the last few minutes really, you know, shows that there's so many different things going on in different kind of spaces, and joining the dots between them is really important, because we certainly have on the demand side much more investor attention in biodiversity and nature. It will lead to companies taking steps to address their nature-related risks, setting targets, making commitments like for deforestation-free commodities. And then on the other side, you have, you know, landholders facing all sorts of barriers and kind of decision making around whether to engage with these environmental markets going forward. Lots of questions around how they should be designed, particularly to pick up that last question around how you know, really integrate climate and nature related solutions together in the market. So it's a very interesting space. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to finish with a quick slide with some contact details. We've are just forming a new network across Monash University, bringing together the researchers that have been involved in this webinar series, and hopefully some others, to continue to explore some of these questions around nature positive. So our website is up there on the slide. You can find out a little bit more about that there, and also the email addresses for the presenters is on the slide. So please get in touch with us if you'd like to discuss any of these issues further. And thanks again for your participation. And thank you very much for the 3 really insightful presentations today.
Thanks, Anita, for the invitation.
Thanks all.